It's my pleasure now to welcome on the Executive Director of Lifeline Direct, Robert Sams. Robert, how are you today?
Hey, I'm doing well, thank you.
That's the way.
Yeah, just considering where many of us are in the country right now, I'm grateful for what I've got in my life. That's for sure.
That's it, and I think that's one of the biggest things I've tried to take out of this whole 18 months, if you could call it 18 months now. It doesn't feel like that, but trying to find things that are grateful for is a huge step to getting through this and getting through each day. So it's a brilliant attitude to take. Before we get into you and all the work you do with Lifeline, we need to paint the picture first of who Robert is. So first off, who's Robert Sams?
Yeah, great question. I think I'd love to introduce myself socially, I guess, and that means that very much I exist with others. You know, I'm a dad, I'm a husband. My daughter's 17, turning 18 next month.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit scary doing a HSC up here in New South Wales.
Yeah.
My wife, who happens to be her birthday today, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
To celebrate on the first day of spring. A brother, and part of a really tight family, but a big family, and that family comes from an Irish descent, mainly on my mum's side, and dad's. And when you get together in that family, you really feel part of what it means to be human. So very much about connecting to others, I guess, is who I am. Born in the Hunter Valley and bred up there, which is 2 hours or so north of Sydney, and lived there most of my life, but done stints in Sydney and on the central coast of New South Wales as well.
Would you consider yourself proud to be from that region? I know a lot of people who are from particular regions often say that they're proud and they never want to leave. Is that you?
Yeah, it is. It's I think for many reasons. One, I think it's a beautiful part of the world, lovely beaches and close to vineyards and wine country and all those beautiful things about the country. But also, it's where my family are, my wife's family are, and connected to those. Those connections are really important to me. So yeah, very proud of where we are. But also part of my role, which I'm sure we'll get to later on, is looking after different parts of across the country in terms of Lifeline. And so, really appreciate the localness and how people feel connected to their local communities.
You're an extremely well-read man. You're an author. You're highly educated. So let's get into that. We'll start with the book first, which is called Social Sensemaking, a reflective journal, how we make sense of risk. Talk about the book itself and the origins behind it and why you felt compelled to write it.
Yeah, I think it's an author, yes. A polished author, maybe not so, but really, I guess the key
still counts, mate.
Yeah, it's a reflective journal. It started when I started studying social psychology, which was really around understanding people in the context of the world we live. And while I titled it "How We Make Sense of Risk," in some ways, it's really how we make sense of life. And it's, I guess, its key preface is that the only way really to do that, or the key way we do that, is by living amongst each other, sharing that together. In a world that's very driven to individualism, to think of ourselves, which we do need to do, absolutely. As the saying goes, the minimum unit of a human being is two. And I learnt that from a guy called Graham Long, who used to run the Wayside Chapel in Sydney. And I was fortunate enough when I was doing the study in social psychology, that was the actual venue for a lot of our training, where we went and sat and met with people, and learnt then that the real need that we have as human beings is connections with each other. So social sense making is how do we make sense of the world together? How do we share how we think about things and what things mean to us, and that it ultimately means how we make sense of things in our lives.
Yeah, talk about that. If you look at it from a time right now, for me personally, I never stop talking, but I've noticed when I've gone out and seen friends, or people I know through this, during this whole pandemic, that I find my conversations sometimes are extremely awkward. I almost don't know what to do from some sense. Like, talk about that and sort of how that our connection is essentially, it's completely changed in almost the blink of an eye.
Absolutely. I think, it's a fascinating topic, how we stay connected. And it's funny you say, you talk a lot. I think one of the things I learned by being in a place like the Wayside Chapel, which is in the middle of King's Cross in Sydney, where, as the name suggests, people who come, who are by the wayside, often homeless, connect, and it's their place to be together. And it doesn't matter where they're from or what their background is. And I won't go into it now. There can be many reasons why people become homeless, and for some people it can be in a matter of weeks. My point, I guess, is that connecting, whether we're talking or not, whether we're just sitting alongside and just being with someone else. And I think that's something that we can learn to do a lot better. How do we be with others? And sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's just being present with another person and giving space that can mean so much. But I think the other thing that's really evident, I mentioned I've got a daughter who's nearly 18, and her main mode of communication is on the telephone and text messaging and other formats of social media. And I think I've certainly come to recognise the importance of that form of communication. It is a way that we do communicate in our modern world. And whilst I know my preference is to be in person with another person, that's not a reality aside from who I live with in the house at the moment.
Yeah. Was that a hard thing to come to? I'm very much the same as you. I very much despise my phone. I hate being on it. I'm much more of a, face-to-face person. Is that hard for you to sort of, or was it hard for you to embrace that fact that, okay, not everyone's going to communicate this way, I have to kind of adapt?
For me, yes. I guess it's an interesting one. We do it in work often with email and that kind of communication. But I think outside of that, I'm very much about connecting with people in person and just, sharing experiences, whether that be a meal or going to a sporting game or whatever it is, together. And when you miss those things, it can be hard to adapt. But I guess the thing about COVID is, in many ways, it's forced us to do that. We've had no choice. And so I think, I love the term. People talk often about resilience, and I think it's a thing, but I put forward that maybe it's resiliencing. It's a thing we continue to learn to do, and it's a continued growing. So, rather than sort of saying, oh, I'm now resilient because I've been through 18 months of COVID, I'm continuing to learn and understand myself, how I'm going to be dealing with that.
Yeah, it sort of never stops. There is going to be a point in time when this part of our journey is over, but there are going to be other bumps in the road where, you're not sort of just equipped to it, just because we went through this sort of like 18-month or 2-year stretch.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think about, people in Victoria who I think is at 7 now lockdowns, it's
6.
Number 6. This is
number 6.
And yes, and that's the point, right? It's been in and out. And I think on the one hand, you can say, well, we just got to get used to it, and that's it. And that's the easy explanation. But I think the reality is we've learnt how to do it we're learning how to do it as we go through. And inevitably that means there's ups and downs. There has to be good days with bad or bad days with good. That's just how I think life is. We can't always be on the highs of, connecting with others and things going well. There just will be days where things go down. And, I know we'll talk about Lifeline a bit later on, but it's one of the things that we're there for, is when people feel like there is no one else to reach out for at those moments where there's feels like there's no one else to connect with. Well, there is. And I think that's a really important part of learning over the last 18 months, is that there has to be ups, and as many ups as there are downs.
Let's stay on learning. If I was to list off every diploma, certificate, master's degree that you have, not only would it put me to shame, but we'd probably run out of time. So you studied around the psychology of risk and counseling and suicidology. That's just to name a few. Talk about, what it is about further educating yourself that sort of appeals to you, and sort of your biggest takeaway from this type of education.
Yeah, I tell you first what it's not, and it's definitely not about bits of papers. I think not that that's the easy path, but getting a bit of paper. It's actually about the thinking that required for particularly university studies. It is really a challenging critical thinking and asking deep questions and exploring, and not necessarily to find perfect answers, but to almost have this ongoing exploring. And that's been what study has meant for me, is probably two things. It's that exploring. It's, I love reading But when I read a book, I like to ask it questions and go, where are you coming from in this? Who is the author? And when was it written? And what's the context? And I think, so for me, study is less about sort of an academic purpose as it is about a way of thinking, or an encouragement to think in a certain way. And the other thing I think about learning is, most of the time, back to the point of social sense making, is I love to explore that learning with others, because I appreciate my perspectives come from my context and my experience in my life. And by sharing and asking questions with others, I know that my learning, it can only grow from that, rather than just being limited to what I've experienced in my life.
Yeah, I'm strongly of the belief that you take something out of every interaction you have with someone, whether that's a positive or a negative thing. There's truly something that you won't take away from someone that you take away from another person. Would you agree with that?
I do, and I'd put one further remark. I think often we don't even know what that is until afterwards. What do I mean by that? I think there's a great saying by Dewey, who's one of the great educators, but we don't know what we're going to say until we hear what was said. And I think that was the whole point of the reflective journal. Is I was experiencing things as I was learning, particularly the social psychology study, but I'd often write short blogs and go, what was that I learned, and how does that apply in my life? And it was really, most of the time I ended up with questions rather than answers.
Yeah.
And to me, it was it's the reflecting and ongoing reflecting, I think, is just as important as the sort of, the class you might be in, or the essay you might have written. It's reflecting on that and continuing to reflect, where I think real learning, or part of real learning, occurs.
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to make my high school teachers proud by saying this, but I think that sort of shows that you are, taking in, retaining the information is when you have those questions. It's that, the times where, you've just listened to a lecturer for an hour and you've just gone, all right, cool. What am I getting for lunch? That's when you probably haven't really taken in the information.
And I think we don't give credit enough to our unconscious in learning. So what do I mean by that is that there'll be a bunch of stuff that we don't know we're learning until we've, with hindsight, thought back to, or I still think back to lectures now or experiences in life and go, now maybe that was what was going on. And there's a lot. I mean, this was one of my great takeouts from studying or just learning about social psychology was, there is much in our unconscious, for example, like signs and symbols that we learn from in our life. It's no surprise that kids at a very young age, recognise McDonald's symbols probably before they can say mum and dad sometimes. It's meant to be that way. That's from a marketing perspective. So, there's a lot of stuff that's really powerful in learning that's not just the sort of conscious stuff that you learn by passing a mark.
Before your time at Lifeline, you were the owner and principal consultant of Dolphin, which is a company that specialized in supporting organizations to improve their culture. Talk about that experience and what impact you were able to make within organizations.
Yeah, it was, look, it was a really fun part of my life. So I did some planning. I don't mind admitting I've been thinking for a couple of years, and planning's the seeds to start my own consultancy. And I ran it for about 7 years. Bit of a risk, as any small business owner will know when you start a business. And I was lucky that I was able to work with some really great people along the way and learned a lot, accountants and peers and colleagues alike, as well as clients. But Dolphin, I think probably worth exploring the name itself. I thought long and hard. I wanted something that would create a name that would create a question for people to engage with. What is that about? And when I ask people, what do you know of dolphins? You get the usual, playful animals. Not that good. Yes, I want to be, let's learn through play. Let's have fun together in work. That was part of it. They're also known as great communicators, and they gather and kind of live in packs. So they're social animals themselves, and I knew those things were really important to me. I did learn, though, I don't mind sharing, I was in a presentation one day, and I didn't know this fact before I started, but one of the people I was presenting to, her husband was a marine biologist and did say that dolphins are the most sexually promiscuous animal as well. So I wish I'd known that, but it certainly wasn't. That wasn't the intention at the start. But
No.
dolphin, it was lots of fun. I got to work with some cool people and cool organisations, and the key. I think the key to that is the freedom that you have running your own organisation to really be who you want, and the downside for me personally is I hate selling myself. I hate talking about myself often.
Yeah.
As contradictory that is talking to you on a podcast, but
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
you soon learn what you've got to do or not.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I've had a handful of people who have literally stopped mid answer, and it's usually an incredible answer, and they go, "Oh, I'm talking too much about myself." I'm like, well, that's actually, funny enough, that's actually why you're here today. So you're absolutely not alone in that front. Let's get into Lifeline Direct. As we mentioned, but at the top, you're the executive director. Talk about how you started with the company.
Yeah, it interestingly coincided with when I started Dolphin. One of the things you have to get used to when you're consulting, but I needed a bit of work on, was you're effectively an hourly rate or a daily rate. When you're consulting, you're selling your services or your expertise or whatever it might be, but ultimately you're selling time. And so I started in March 2012, Dolphin, and I started with Lifeline in November 2012, so 6 or so months later, when I was just searching for something else that wasn't attracted to an hourly rate. My reason for work wasn't just about what money was coming in the door. Also was consulting in a similar space. Was on the local board at Lifeline in Newcastle on the Hunter, and they were looking for some skills that I'd had around human resources and risk management and health and well-being. So by chance, happened to be having a coffee with him, and he mentioned that, and so I joined the board there locally as a volunteer director in November 2012, and I soon learned. I mean, I knew, as most people who are listening today probably know, about our 13, 11, 14 service. You hear it on the end of the news. You hear it. You see it in newspapers when there's been a story of grief or trauma, etc. So I knew about the service, but I didn't know about the organisation. And my goodness, in those nearly 9 years, I've learnt how wonderful it is as an organisation, how wonderful the people are, what they give to others is so special. But so I started there, and in 2012, by 2017, we'd made some changes, and a number of the local Lifeline centres decided to join together. So they used to be quite independent, and they joined together, and that's what is known as Lifeline Direct. So it's Lifeline centres that go from the north of New South Wales in Lismore down through the New England, the Hunter Central Coast, and in Victoria, in Geelong and southwest Victoria, down to Warrnambool, and along the coast there. And those centres decided to join together, and we have shared services. So we have one finance system now instead of 6, and et cetera. So we can perform a bit more efficiently and productively behind the scenes, which ultimately means we've got more money to spend on our services in the front line of what we do, which is the suicide prevention and crisis support. Sure. So that's the short history, I guess, of Lifeline Direct and my involvement in it. I started in a management position in 2017.
Everyone sort of feels pulled towards a certain type of work. Whether they do that or not is a different question. But what was it about this line of work that sort of pulled you towards it?
I think there's probably 2 or 3 key things. One is I've recognised this in later years. I'm very much at the heart of who I am, a helper, and I'll explain that carefully. I guess what I've learnt that is at Lifeline is someone who is comfortable being beside and sitting beside another, in whatever that pain might be, or hurt or grief. And that's very different to my early career, which I describe as almost being a fixer or policer. So when I started my career substantially was in health and safety, and I definitely wanted to help then, but I recognised the environment often required policing. People putting their hard hats on and safety glasses, and it's what got me into social psychology. I won't get off topic too much, but it's what got me into social psychology, because I wanted to move beyond policing people and policies and procedures to actually, what does it mean to help? What does it mean to coach and guide and support? And that's what I see Lifeline is very much about that. When people ring Lifeline, at all times of the day, no matter what it is, we see each person as an individual in that moment. And we're there to sit alongside them effectively. We can't solve lifeline complex trauma in one phone call or one interaction or one text message, but we can be there and say, another human being cares enough to sit alongside you. And for me, that's what Lifeline's about. It's one of the key things for me, is that we are there no matter the time of the day or night, no matter who the person is and where they are in Australia. We don't discriminate. You can reach out and get that support. So that's, I guess they're the things that I love about us, is that, we don't have to have the pressure of solving complex problems. What we do is we be there for people when they need it, in a time and a place, and in a way they need it.
There's always going to be an importance for this line of work, and you could argue that this time right now is probably the most important time. We see record number of calls to the centres and the hotlines, and you've got young kids in school experiencing disconnect and that real lack of connection. But how are you going personally right now?
It's a good question. I described before that there's the ups and downs in life, and I think I'm recognising that there are ups and down days is the reality. The days that I love most are when I feel connected and we've achieved certain things, and and you're right, we've broken, I think it was 5 records in August, one after the other, of highest calls. All of a sudden it was 3,400, followed by this, followed by that. So I think it was 5 times in 1 month we broke our record, and so that's a feeling of feeling really good that we're there to support people. But in terms of how I go, there's ups and down days as well. And I think whilst I work with an organisation that's got an awesome purpose, and what we do each day is amazing, and I know it makes a difference, there's still the pressures in the sort of day job, if you like, of running an organisation. And right now, in our part of the organisation, we have 30 retail shops that support our services. There's 50% of our revenue comes from those. And as I talk to you today, all of them are shut. And so that's some real pressure on our organisation at a time where we haven't been busier and the demand for our services hasn't been greater. So there's those real leadership challenges, and for me that's when real leadership stands up. Running the day-to-days, I wouldn't say easy, but the easy part. These are the challenging times, and this is when I think leadership really needs to step up, and this is where I really need to be provide the vision and the support for our organisation so that we can make it through.
Yeah. How do you balance that when you sort of talk about, those days where yourself better than anyone, when you know that you're not at 100%? How do you manage that and still, be there for everyone else through the organisation and be that leader?
I think I might answer that in 2 ways. I think the first one is not always well, because I'm human. There'll be days where I've not done it well, I'm sure, and my team will probably be the best ones to tell us that. But I think the other answer is there's 3 things that we look for in a crisis supporter. Attributes, if you like. The first 2 are empathy and compassion, and that probably makes lots of sense. But the third one I might talk to you about is self-awareness. And a big part of the training to become a crisis supporter, which I've done, is getting to know yourself. So when we're talking to people on the telephone, what are our biases or triggers or things that might mean that we can't sit alongside people as well as we'd like? So we're aware of those. And so I take that into my role. I take that into my role at work, my role here at home with my wife and my family, and try to, that's the whole point of the book that I wrote, Reflective Journal, was I sit down and reflect and try and ask, who was I today? when I got cranky in that situation, what was it? When I felt frustrated at something or whatever it might be, asking the question, who was I and what was happening today, and try and get that self-awareness, I think is really critical. And I guess with that, not being too hard on ourselves, particularly at the moment, because, if there's days at the moment where we're not getting frustrated or cranky about something, we're probably not being real with ourselves. And so I think that's a really important part. Going, it's okay, I can be frustrated because there's frustrating things, or I can be exhausted because there's been lots of things going on. So I think, to answer your question as simply as I can, I think it's self-awareness of who we are. Social psychology will say who we are and what's the environment we're in and how's that affecting us and what's it doing to us, if you like.
For someone who's deep in the battle against some of the negative side effects of the pandemic, and someone who's, well researched and equipped to talk about it, paint a picture for me for where you think we are right now in dealing with this as a whole.
I think the first answer must be that I think it's really complex. And I'm not trying to avoid answering the question, but I think there's so many factors at play. That our temptation is to try and sort of answer questions like that with a grab that might meet a headline. And I get that in some environments we need to provide people with clarity, but the reality is that there are so many different layers to what's going on at the moment. I think there are probably, this is not research, so don't quote me on the numbers, but I suspect there's almost equal number of people who are anxious about getting a vaccine or what it might do as it hasn't been tested. And I don't mean, what people call anti-vaxxers. I just mean people who are worried about that. And they've probably, many of those have still got the vaccine, versus people who are worried about mental health and the effects of being locked up or locked down, I'm sorry. And I think both of those things are equally valid for people. People will have their own concerns, and it's really hard to have a one-size-fits-all solution. And I'm really empathetic to that, which is not to say I think people should be marching in droves. I'm trying not to take that position, but I'm just trying to understand different people's perspectives to things. I think I'm no expert, but when you think about anxiety and what makes people anxious, there is a natural anxiety we all have and should have, nerves at the very front end of the continuum. There's nerves if you're doing certain things in life, talking on a podcast, that are good and healthy and mean that we can think about things. And then, of course, there's at the other end of the continuum anxiousness that impacts on your life or means that you can't do some things that otherwise every day we might do. So trying to really understand that in this context of real disruption to the world, where I suspect there are some answers along the way, but there's many more questions for people. And I think it's those questions and the ambiguity that are really challenging for people. We really do like clarity as human beings. We love to get, in some ways it's control. One of our greatest fears, I argue, is our own death. And that's probably a podcast in itself. But, when we fear being hurt and we fear death, naturally that creates anxiety. And I think at the moment, the lack of certainty and the continuous ambiguity really mean that that's the real challenge, I think, for a lot of people, not knowing.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Just speaking from my personal experiences, that there is we get it on daily doses, where there's that, you wait for the, the daily numbers. And, if it's too high, it sends you off into an absolute spiral of, holy shit, this is never going to end. And then if it's low, you're like, oh my God, we might get out of there, but we got to wait for tomorrow. And it's that never sort of ending cycle. And like, I was an avid watcher of it during the, lockdowns 1 and 2. And my mind has shifted a million miles away from that. I won't watch press conferences. I won't watch the news. I get enough people telling me what the daily numbers are and what's happening. And I just try and sort of disconnect myself from that, because I know it triggers my anxieties and my, the feeling of helplessness where, I think that's probably the biggest thing for me I've found is just learning, all right, we're not going to get out of this tomorrow. Let's learn what works and what doesn't work. And let's, find that coping mechanism to move forward with.
I think absolutely. And you just reminded me, one of the things we study in social psychology is the effect of, media. And, you think about, you just mentioned the daily press conference. And not only the daily press conference, the daily press conference that's then repeated on, whatever news you might follow at night on whatever channel, usually followed by, half an hour, if it's an hour news bulletin of those same numbers versed in different ways and different contexts. And, I think flooding of people with information is a real challenge for us right now. I think of kids, for example, there's just so much information and it's not that different. The numbers almost become hard to imagine after a while, or conversely, they flow into one another. It's 1,000 in New South Wales today. It's 1,100. It's 1,200, and in some ways, the numbers might become meaningless to some people because they're too hard to comprehend. But I think I just wanted to go back to the point about the media. I think there's a local guy on the ABC in Newcastle up here where I live, Craig Hamilton, who's a known sports guy. He's got his own book out that talks about his living with bipolar. That's not what I was going to share, but he's in the media. He works for the local ABC radio station, and he wrote a blog recently that was really saying put boundaries around your own media consumption. That's what helps him. He has a mental illness that he deals with very well in his life. But one of the things he has to do is put boundaries around it, because if he doesn't, then the anxiety is really hard to deal with. So I think that's and that's a fairly modern thing, right? It wasn't the case maybe 20 years ago, but the constant media on all forums. So whether you're watching the television or the radio or picking up, as you said before, those damn phones and looking on social media, you could just be flooded with it. And I think that does add to the feelings of overwhelmness.
Yeah, well, it's sort of, if you think back to even say 15 years ago, you'd read the newspaper and you'd watch the news, and that was it. Getting internet access on your phone was so difficult. Now I get, push notifications on Twitter if a certain hockey player signs with someone, and it's instant. And in some cases, the person who's been traded or something, he doesn't even know yet. And here I am at 3 a.m. in Victoria, and I know before him. So it is obviously technology is progressing, and it's a wonderful thing for so many reasons. But from this aspect, it really can be a nightmare for some people.
Yeah. One of the things I put forward in the book that I think is both simplistic and complex at the same time, which is the word paradox. Understanding the world paradoxically, like knowing that two things that seemingly shouldn't exist do. We need information. We want that information, but it can, at the same time, that can be too much information, can be both good and bad for us, if that makes sense. We want to have access to information. We need to know certain things, but at the same time can cause, anxiety in that sense. And if we can, I know that's a hard sort of concept to grab, but if we can try to understand the world, it's easy to understand the world in black and white. Is it black or is it white? And that's how we naturally want to understand the world, because that's much easier. And I think there are certain things that we do that, and that's fine. But for much of it, it's very much the grey. There is if we can accept some greyness to it, then not everything is going to be black or white. But sometimes there's going to be black and white together, and sometimes that's going to be grey, and that's hard to understand. Just allowing that thought, I think, can be helpful, because otherwise I think we almost we cause ourselves great concern by trying to be so black and white with things that can't work like that.
For people who don't necessarily know about the services that Lifeline Direct offer, talk about that and just sort of how you guys help.
Yeah, I think our flagship service, if you like, is our National Crisis Line, which is 13 11 14. And it's available, I mentioned before, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to everybody in Australia. And we don't discriminate. Anybody can call. We accept that everybody's version of what might be a crisis or what might be challenging for them is different. So that's 13 11 14 on the phone service. We also have a similar text service. So it's the same number, but on the text it's 0477 13 11 14, and that runs from midday to midnight. And that's a similar service, but it's a different demographic that often uses that service. And we know when we first piloted the text service that 44% of people said that they wouldn't have contacted Lifeline if not for the text service. So that's really pleasing that we're opening up to a new group of people who can reach out in a new and different way, as we talked about before. We have a chat service which is available on our website, lifeline.org.au, and that's a web chat service where people might want to have an interaction that way as opposed to a text. And then around the country, we have a whole range of community-based services that include video counselling, for example. So if people want to access a counsellor but aren't able to leave home, which is an obvious thing at the moment, we can do that via video. And there's many reasons people can't leave home aside from COVID, but people suffering with real anxiety, for example, may struggle to get up and get out of the house. And so we can be a service that can support them through that. We have a whole range of community capacity building training and education. So we don't want people to just have to rely on the Lifeline service. We want to build capacity so people are able to help each other and help people in their families and communities and sporting clubs and workplaces. And then recently, and it's something I'm super proud of, we've started a service called Aftercare. And it's the moment the Lifeline Aftercare service is running in the Hunter and New England regions of New South Wales, but it is a support service designed for people who have had an attempt at suicide. And it's very much a service that is all about that person at the centre. And so we have a range of services, like a care coordinator that's dedicated to be there for them and guide them through a period after a suicide attempt. Sometimes that's as simple as having a cuppa or a chat when times might be tough. There's access to a different after hours phone service that's dedicated for that. There's connection with others in community. So sometimes it might be that people need to or want to connect with other organisations like men's sheds or service clubs or whatever it might be in those communities. And I'm really super proud that our team has put that together. And it's a really critical time for people after a suicide attempt to feel supported. And I'm super proud that we've got a program that does that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Talk about moving forward this time, and for both you personally and for Lifeline, and how you think the business can, continue to help Australians, in the best sort of capacity you can.
Yeah, I think, for me, I just, and like many in the social services and helping industries, it is a way of being now. It's a way of living. It's very dangerous being careful that it's not, I was going to say it's not just a job, it's a way of what I do. But of course, with that has to be boundaries. There are times when it has to turn off. But for me, I'm very passionate about what we do. We're a network of centres across the country, Lifeline, and I'm really proud that we work together and share ideas with each other across different communities. I think I'm really proud, and I can't, that network will continue to work really closely together with really a key person in mind, and that's those who seek our help. I think we are in a really cool space at the minute in what is a digital transformation in many ways for Lifeline. So that text service, for example, is running 12 hours a day. I hope to be able to talk to you sometime in the future that's not beyond the next 6 to 12 months, and that'll be 24 hours a day. So that means at any time of the day you can reach out in those two different channels. And I think our video counselling service has got a lot to offer people going forward, and particularly as the current restrictions that we've got, but beyond that as well for people who really struggle to be able to get into a physical setting. Yeah, and then I think, as I talked about before, the aftercare, I'm probably not surprisingly from what we've talked about so far, I think any service that we can provide that can connect people to support each other, not just through the digital channels, but through the work we do in community, I think is critically important to complement the work we do digitally as well.
Lastly, let's talk about donations. A company like Lifeline uses donations to make significant impacts into not only the business, but people who genuinely need it. Talk about the dollar amounts that people can sort of donate, and then what that directly goes to and how they can help. Because I was reading over it on the website, and it's staggering how much money can actually make a huge difference.
You bet. I think the first thing I'd like to say, is there are two parts to this. Is a bit simple, but two parts to Lifeline: a national head office, which I'm part of, and we are very grateful for money received from the federal government and state governments, that we could not do our work without government funding. There's no doubt. But it is sometimes a myth that our service is fully government funded. It's not. And I mentioned before, just the part of Lifeline I look after, 50% of our revenue comes from retail shops. So, donating to Lifeline, first of all, what does it do? So it will directly contribute to the services. I mentioned before how Lifeline Direct got together so it could minimise the administrative costs at the back end to spend more money on our frontline services. And that's what our focus always is. So to give you an idea, it costs us around $39 to answer a call. And that's the science behind that is the cost that it takes to train people. And people often have the myth that because we're a volunteer-led organisation that it doesn't cost a lot, but there's significant supervision and professional development and support required for our volunteers. So it costs about $4,500 to train a volunteer, will take, and then about $39 to answer each of the calls. And there's a bit over 1 million calls each year. So that's to give you an idea of what it takes to run Lifeline. And then to donate to us, really, I think that's, I try not to have, say this is a priority versus that, because there's a lot of priorities in the organisation. Yeah, absolutely, to look after our people who do critical work. But the other one is that we can't do that unless we have revenue coming in. And we must respect those donations people give to Lifeline because they want to see that money go to supporting people. And that's absolutely our accountability and responsibility, is to make sure that as much of that money goes towards the frontline services, delivering our crisis support service on the text, phone, chat, in community as possible.
Robert, thank you so much for your time. It's absolutely incredible learning about you and also the work that you do with Lifeline and Lifeline itself, and how they're helping out so many people right now who, probably a couple of years ago, they probably didn't think they would head down this road. So thank you for that and for the work you do and you continue to help. And it was a lot of fun chatting with you today. Great,
thank you. And look, I think if I could end with, at the moment, a person's calling Lifeline about every 30 seconds. If that's you, that's great. We welcome it. Call at any time. We'll be there to meet you. We'll be there to be with you. We won't try and, fix your problems. We certainly won't judge you. We'll be there for you. And I encourage people to pick up the phone. And I encourage people equally to pick up the phone to the local Lifeline Centre if you want to support their work.